All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Would you be able to let everybody know your name, what you did while you were in the military, and what led you to my video talking about military right to repair?
So my name is Kevin Corsi. I joined the Navy right out of high school as an electronics technician nuclear, which consists of operating and maintaining the reactor plant specifically for submarines for me. I did that for 6 years, and then I got out to be government contractor in electronics. And I found your video just by YouTube recommended. I care very much about the right to repair, and I was inspired to reach out to you specifically because I've been having issues specifically related to that at work.
Oh, very cool. So you served on the SSBN 730 Henry M. Jackson, which was your choice. Is there a reason that you picked that particular ship to serve on?
Yes, so I chose that one both because it's location in Washington and because it's the oldest of its class. The nuclear side for engineering has two types of hardware. It's type 1 and type 2. The modern version is transitioning to type 2, which basically means more microprocessor and uniform hardware. Type 1 was the not necessarily the analog original, but the in between version between the 70s technology and the equipment of today. So I wanted to pick that one both because I knew that the inevitable interaction with older equipment would get me to understand it more. And because I heard as soon as I joined it and was training before I got to make that decision that the operators on type 1 equipment were more respected, mainly because you had to know more of the stuff because there was less automatic actions taken.
All right, so you talked about being Navy certified as a repair technician, but you're only allowed to do component level repairs under certain emergency conditions. So can you tell me what it's like having all the knowledge to be able to do specific repairs, but then not being able to? What were the repairs that you could do versus couldn't do? What do you mean by emergency condition, and what you believe was driving this?
Yes, so the Navy training was including things that I've never actually been able to do, like trace repair. It mainly consisted of soldering like through hole components. The equipment I worked with, we never saw any surface mount, but mainly it was wiring and cable harness replacement. The difficulty with that is specifically being on a submarine, it was make the equipment work. We can pull into port and then the Navy would give it to an external contractor to do touch up, verify that it works, and then they would sell it back to us. What's frustrating about that is that I believe a lot of resources were invested for people to get relatively underutilized. I work with people that were former Navy from 40 years ago. They talk about being able to repair virtually anything. And now I believe my perspective may be skewed because nuclear, it has to be done a very specific way. But there were multiple cases where instead of saying, oh, we think this is the problem, let's replace this specific component, like, oh, this cap blew. Obviously, that's a problem, and we should look into what caused that. We just replace the entire board and then just have it collect dust for the entire deployment. Now,
Now,
for the operational side of things, that makes sense.
one of the things that we would do here for customers is if there was somebody who really wanted something done immediately, we have a stock of replacement boards. Behind me is just a stock of old donor junk that's been recycled here. But we would have a stack of boards that were fully functional that we had fixed. And if somebody says, I need this to work in an hour, I'm not taking out a microscope and a schematic and everything. If it's a complex issue, I would replace their board, and then their board, if they were willing to not take the old one back, we'd go in the shelf, we'd fix that on our own time, we'd figure out what's wrong with it, and that was different than having to do something in an emergency scenario. So one of the things that we do here is we'll do board replacements as well as board repairs. And here it's a kind of a different situation. You were saying that you would do repairs under emergency situations. Here we would do repairs if somebody was willing to wait, but if they were not willing to wait, then we usually have a bunch of boards that they can pick from. Not these. These are all donors and junk and recycled. But we have a nicely catalog section of boards that actually work. If somebody says, I want this back in 5 minutes, we're not doing a board repair for them because there's a lot of diagnostic work that goes into it. But if you're willing to wait a few days, we'll do that board repair for you. And if you're not willing to wait a few days, we can swap your board with a working one at a higher price tier. So what is it like when you have a system where you can only do the repairs in an emergency scenario? Because in an emergency scenario, I would want to just take something and replace it with something that works rather than have to do component level repair where there's troubleshooting, diagnostics, I'm not quite sure if I can fix the problem, and everything like that.
The majority of the time, we would just do a swap of the entire card. And because just replacing the entire piece of equipment fixed the immediate issue, we would never get the opportunity to exercise our skills. So we would have in supply the designated amount of spares for everything that was considered vital. And if something were to break, we would just go to supply, get that, and then replace it. And then give the old card to supply saying, hey, this is bad. We're going to return it to the contractor or whoever. And then they would take a look at it. So that's part of why it was frustrating for the people that took the time to get that training, because there would be competitions basically to say, oh, hey, I finally get to fix something that you can't do a hot swap of. Let's see who's been here the longest that hasn't gotten to solder something yet. Like if you need to replace a multi-wafer contactor, you can't just take the board and unplug it. You actually have to solder for that, at least for type 1 equipment. But for something that plugs into a backplane, you're just going to take the card out and replace it, and that's it.
Because I don't have any experience in the military in this regard. So what I'm saying is likely very ignorant. Tell me if you get the idea of the flow. But if there is a Houthi missile headed towards here and there's some missile defense system on the submarine, I do not want to take out my soldering iron, my multimeter, my power supply, my schematic. I want to go and grab the working card, because usually you have spares, grab that and plug it in as soon as possible. It's if that breaks and I'm at home or at port or you're at a base, that's when I may say, okay, let me try to fix the broken one versus when there's an emergency situation. And I think with that type of situation, since I'm fixing them when it's not mission critical, I actually have the component level repair knowledge. Whereas if I'm replacing things and I'm only doing component level repairs in an emergency situation, how am I going to test my skills? How am I going to remember, do I have the proper tactic to reball the chip with 0.25 millimeter solder balls? How do I know if I remember how to do a trace repair without the accidentally cutting off a little too much of the insulation on the wire so it touches the chip or the solder pad next to it on a QFN? How do you exercise those skills if you are doing replacements when it's not an emergency and you're only doing repairs when it is an emergency?
To be honest, you just straight up don't. If you're in port or underway, regardless, it's the same. You virtually never get to use those skills, which is quite disappointing. The reason why I was so excited to go to the civilian side is I would say within the first month of me being there, I did more hands-on repair than my entire time in the Navy of like individual pieces of equipment. There were times where I had to rewire large portions of something that was a drawer that could get removed, but that's because it was like a one of one type thing. Virtually all instances of something that was directly soldered to a piece of equipment that wasn't through a terminal board connection or something, it would just get completely swapped, and those skills would never get exercised.
So just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, where you worked, the policy was if you have donors and spares, even if we're not in an emergency situation whatsoever, we're always going to use the donor spare and replace it, and we're only going to do component level repairs during an emergency.
Correct.
Now, one of the things here is, again, we are what we do. So if I am replacing things on a regular basis for 6 months to a year, and then I have to do a component level repair for a customer because I don't have the part in stock, they said they need this thing, they have a presentation at 9 o'clock, they need their data, it's 8:45 right now, I have to make this thing work. If I've been replacing boards for a year, even if I have that institutional knowledge, I'm probably going to slip when I'm using the soldering iron. I may forget that I have to hold a hot air station at this angle versus this angle so that I don't heat the chip that's right next to the chip that I'm replacing. I may forget about the amount of time that I can spend with heat on this chip versus that one so that the underfill doesn't expand and make all the solder balls come out. You are what you do. So if you're not doing those repairs on a regular basis because you're not allowed to, then what happens when an actual emergency comes up where you do need those component level repair skills if you haven't been exercising them the entire time? Because as a manager of this company who used to do thousands and thousands of board repairs and film them, right now, if somebody put a board in front of me and said this has to be working in 10 minutes for one of the newer devices, I would not do a good job compared to the people here that do those repairs every single day that we've trained for 10.
I think the mitigating action the Navy takes for that is just having enough spares and designing the hardware to not have situations where you run into that. The reality is you just hope for the best is really what it is. And that's a terrible answer, but that's the reality.
It's the right
of what
answer
it is.
though, and that's what I'm looking for. It's not, I wouldn't say the right, but it's the correct and truthful answer, and that's interesting. I'm not going to say the most, but one of the 5 or top 10 aggravating examples of something that you knew how to fix but you weren't allowed to touch. This hasn't been with the Navy so far, that I have spoken to people in the Marines and the Army that said they knew how to fix something. They joined the Army to fix something. They did the component level repair because they knew it was wrong, and then they were summarily disciplined because their job is not to fix it. Their job is to put a little tag on it that says, for the manufacturer to fix at many multiples of my daily pay, which I imagine is incredibly frustrating. Because even if you're going to get paid to be there regardless, there is this feeling of something left today better than it was because I was here. And at least in the Marines, when I talk to their service members, all of them feel like them, especially the Marine airplane mechanics. I want everything to leave better than it came in. So not being able to do that and have that kick of dopamine seems a real kick in the nuts. What are the most frustrating examples of something that you knew how to fix, but you're not allowed to touch it?
I think it's worth noting that my perception is through nuclear equipment, and the reason why the Navy is gone for so long without any accidents is because of the way they've designed their systems and their very scrutinous and arduous control of who touches what equipment and how. That being said, even simple things like what I was saying before we started recording about, hey, I know this procedure tells me to replace this card first, but it's so blatantly obvious it's the power supply. But especially nuclear, you have to follow the procedure step by step exactly, even if you disagree with it. Now, obviously, you can bring it up, but when it comes to external equipment that we've been given and installed, you have to follow the procedure. So what ends up happening is you generate a lot of e-waste, basically, following a procedure until you finally rectify the problem. Even our handheld tools, like the Fluke 289s, that's my favorite multimeter by far. If it falls out of cal, even if you have somebody that knows how to recalibrate and verify that it works, it's like it doesn't exist. As soon as any piece of equipment falls out of calibration, you may as well just put it in a locker and then, as you referenced, put a tag on it, say, hey, don't use this. It's that for virtually everything.
So you've talked about rejecting hundreds of thousands of dollars of circuit boards because they were stapled shut in an ESD bag. You talk a little bit about that?
So when we receive a part from supply, there is something called a receipt inspection. You go through the list that's in the tech manual, verifying the condition of the equipment. And especially with, through hole equipment like vertical caps, if they're stacked, they get crushed, bent over, they exceed their lead bend radius that is acceptable. And, you're not just going to bend it back. You're going to say, hey, I can't use this. Or like you referenced, for ESD bags, the whole point of ESD is to not allow for unintentional shocks. But if you are sealing a bag with a metal staple, that basically defeats the entire purpose of that protection being there. And I can't, in good faith, install a piece of equipment, regardless of its cost, if we don't know the status of it. So what ends up happening is, because we have to have all these spares because we're likely not going to replace it and fix it ourselves, the sheer volume results in sometimes improper handling or storage, which perpetuates the waste because you can't use some of them.
How does that staple making its way into there, the supply chain? And I know snitches get stitches. I'm just curious. Is this somebody who doesn't know any better? Is this somebody being belligerent, or what's going on there?
I don't know what caused it, but it's either the contractor site that sent it to us, or more likely somebody in the supply chain was just doing their job. And if they have a procedure that says, hey, open every bag and make sure that we got the right part, unless it explicitly says or explains why you don't want to reseal it with a staple rather than like a special tape or something, or just a new ESD bag preferably, they're not going to know to do that. So by the time the bureaucracy passes the part through all the hands to where it gets to somebody that can go, hey, that doesn't look right, you're already underway with a limited amount and is already ruined potentially.
So what happens to those hundreds of thousands of dollars of circuit boards?
They just get sent back and the cycle repeats.
This is the type of stuff that like when you talk about a bill, say make parts, schematics, diagrams of expect. At least in my industry, I know that Apple will never follow this. I at least have some idea of what it is that I would ask for. And the more I go into this, the more I realize there is so much outside of just make parts, diagrams, and schematics available that are necessary to fix all of your many legitimate and horrible issues there that you're facing. So can you talk about the financial difference between what a repair actually costs versus what the Navy winds up paying for it through this fix, return, and buy cycle?
So for part of it, we're paying for high tolerance mil spec parts. Now, that is very expensive. I'm sure you've seen the Senate hearing where somebody held up a bag of aircraft bolts and said, hey, we pay thousands of dollars for each of these. I wouldn't say it's that expensive for component level, but it's still a high markup. The price of hardware is absurd. I've definitely had thoughts of, hey, I'm holding something that is worth more than the house I'm going to buy eventually. And it's disheartening to see how equipment is handled poorly, knowing how much you're getting paid and how much they're paying for it. One of the main things that was upsetting for me in the military was knowing how much taxes I paid and seeing firsthand where it went. And it didn't go to good needs. Yes, strategic deterrence, nuclear, that's all good. But in the end, it goes to the big five defense companies, really, contractors. It's just a giant siphon.
There was one interesting person that I was speaking to earlier, and he was talking about shipping costs, which is something that I had never considered. So let's say that you need something by next Tuesday. You could, when I'm buying something, I could need something by next Tuesday, next Thursday, next Friday, and you have your little shipping options. You have next day air, $100, priority mail, $15, second day, $40, ground, 10, or slow shipping free. And they don't get to see the shipping prices when they're ordering a piece of equipment. And one of the parts that they had ordered, he had paid over $200,000 to have shipped. And the interesting thing is the system is set up where he can't see the shipping cost. So he was saying, even though this is not my job, if I knew that the difference in shipping cost was going to be $10,000 versus $260,000 to get it 1 or 2 days earlier, I would make my decision based on what it is we actually needed. And I'd even be willing to go to my superior officer and have an argument with him and say, we don't need this thing until next Friday. We can still get it on Tuesday and save $160,000 for the American taxpayer. Let's use that. And there are these weird little inefficiencies like that. And I could hear in his voice what it was like knowing that that was happening. And once you realize that something that just that basic can cause that much of a price difference, and that price difference exists because the person on the other end knows that the person ordering it is never going to see that, that has to be infuriating.
It's basically a blank check. I'm sure people have mentioned it by now, but we joke about how, oh, it doesn't matter, it's monopoly money. It's because the coffers of the government are virtually infinite. Yeah, you're probably paying for something that's been borrowed from Social Security or some vital aspect, but all it is to us is a gigantic database where you check a box, say, yep, I need that, and then it shows up, and you have no idea how much it costs to get there. You see what the alleged prices you're paying for. For some reason, the same database that I could order a resistor in told me the price of like a missile, because it's just everything in one gigantic database. But there is no accountability anywhere. And because you don't have any accountability, what's stopping these companies from charging these exorbitant costs? Anybody with a DoD ID basically can make an account on sam.gov and just see for themselves the contracts and what they pay for. And it is absolutely absurd because you know you can get that. It's the whole supply and demand thing. If you know that you convinced a senator to advocate for signing a contract that's 30 years long with this specific company, they're not going to change that. They're just going to charge whatever they want, because I guarantee they're not going to fix the price. They're just fixing the source.
So you had said that you were in one of the last classes to receive a full digital electronics training before they deemed it unnecessary. Can you give people watching an idea of what it is that deemed unnecessary? What are those skill sets that are deemed unnecessary?
That is a great question. Actually, I have something on my desk to highlight that. They don't think this is important anymore. They don't want to teach us things.
That is a breadboard with a bunch of wires, and I see a couple of little LEDs, the little blinkies. That's what everybody starts with.
Yes, so this brings me up to one of the main points I was wanting to discuss. I think that with the transition to heavily relying on external contractors and then the inevitable goal of having a more specialized but still commercial off-the-shelf equipment, we are diverting our electronics technicians to ITs. It's more software based because the procedure is just, oh, whatever, swap out that card. Somebody else will pay for it, whatever. So when you do that, over time, eventually you're going to get to a point where when you have that critical emergency of, I need to actually fix something, what if all 10 of the boards were stored in the same spot in supply and there was a leak and they all got wet? Or the ESD bag example. If every single person opens and inspects the thing the same way, they're likely going to mess it up every single time. And eventually you're going to run into a case where you need somebody to actually fix something, and that skill has not been established, taught, or practiced.
So this is an issue that I talked about almost 11 years ago now. I was talking about some of the diagnostic stuff that Apple computers came with, and how when you hold a certain key down, it would give you an idea of what the failures were with the machine. And some of the older ones would say, this sensor has failed. So you can kind of get an idea of what the problem is. And a lot of lay people are not going to figure out what a TSOP sensor are, but there are the people that are more than happy to look it up and learn. And then there are newer ones where they started saying, this is an error code. And when you Google that error code, it says, go to Genius Bar, where the manual used to be a manual that is helping you troubleshoot your problem or giving you some idea of the diagnostics, what you need to do. And now that manual is not giving you that information. It's just go to Genius Bar. Can you talk about some of the manuals for repairs that you've seen that seem designed to just leech money out of the military rather than give you what you need to be able to fix the product?
Yes, I know that my platform was type 1 equipment. We had one piece of type 2 equipment. And it's interesting you bring up the error codes, because with type 1, it's a lot harder to write a procedure that says, hey, just swap out this card if swapping out a specific component involves 32 of the solder pot wire connections. Like that's completely infeasible for you to just say, hey, swap it out. But when you get to type 2, they are just error codes. It's not, hey, this thing went bad. It's, oh, hey, replace this card. While it's not as far as, hey, contact this person, it's definitely more of just replace the entire thing outright. It's kind of astonishing to actually see the dichotomy because on the older equipment, you could tell it's from a different time because it goes a lot more in detail. It tells you the why of how, if you short between pins 3 and 4 on this chip, this is what you're going to see. That is way more helpful than if you get error code 53,000, replace the level detector circuit card. Great, thanks. And because of that, they don't have an incentive to make all the information available. And it's very apparent when you have pieces of equipment that you have to get right completely. The reactor plant control panel, for example, crazy detailed because it has to work. But once it gets to something that's still important, but like semi-optional, like, oh, hey, we'll survive without it, the abstraction becomes more and more apparent. And now that I'm on the civilian side of things, it's blatantly obvious. We don't even have as-built drawings for our equipment. We have commercial off-the-shelf hardware, and we just don't know how it's hooked up in some cases.
There's one aircraft mechanic that was talking about not having access to the schematics. He has an issue. He has a basic thing that says this system is attached to this system, and it just has a line going to it. And then when the Boeing technician shows up, he's got this schematic that shows every wire goes to this. Here's exactly what this goes to. And he's like, oh, cool, I want that. And they say, no, you can't have this. And he thinks, like, fucking airplane is this? The militaries are yours. It seems like we paid you a lot of money for it. So can you talk about how the manuals wind up getting written this way? Like, who's benefiting from requiring card-by-card replacement rather than logical troubleshooting of a problem and fixing the exact component that's broken?
I think that problem is twofold. We already discussed the issues with the supply system itself. So the company that made the part is getting kickback for that because if we mess it up, they fix it. But at the same time, they're more likely to not necessarily make a sale, but have a perpetual stream of income when sailors, Marines, anybody can't fix the hardware themselves. One of my coworkers, he worked for the Army. He was considered a wizard because he actually knew how to fix things. He would get calls from former duty stations because there just wasn't any information about it. It's kind of the same thing with certain pieces of hardware where if you somehow Swiss cheese yourself into a situation where you have to fix something and it's not one of the things that they've identified, if you haven't practiced the skills of going, okay, well, the tech manual doesn't say what this indication is, let me flip to the schematic and then understand the system diagram. What am I actually seeing? That isn't necessarily always going to be there. And every time this problem happens, a company is making money and a taxpayer is paying for it.
So you've said that you have one of the highest uptimes globally, specifically because that you actually repair equipment rather than just all this part swapping stuff. Can you talk about some of the concrete examples of repairs that you've done that you would not have been allowed to do now?
Yes, I won't say the company name, but when the site I work at was built, the power amplification system was designed by them. And for some reason, the contract didn't stipulate that we retained the schematic. So, elapsed 20 years, the company doesn't exist anymore, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do. So I spent well over 1,000 man hours last year hand generating net lists. The board was this big. It was through hole from 1998. And because we had no knowledge of what it was, and because it had FPGAs on it, so it was a true black box, I had to go pin by pin and reverse engineer and design the schematic myself because nobody knew what to do. There was no information. And when you run into situations like that, if you don't have the authority or you're too far away, the line gets blurred when ultimately the Navy says, hey, I need this working. Same thing happens with the internet at that site, for example. If you're in a big city and your company has a contract to control how the internet is given through like your local satellite, if that breaks, you're going to contact the company that owns it, and then they would send a technician to you to get it fixed. But I'm so rural out here that the company just says, hey, if you can fix it, great, because it'll take a week to send people out there. So what ends up happening is the people that are here that actually know how to fix things just do that. When you bypass all the bureaucracy, it turns out just letting technicians fix things, maintains uptime, and makes things work.
Imagine that. Can you talk about the response time difference in actually fixing things the way you do it versus going through all the official channels? Because here, I mean, the entire reason for replacing something is that in doing that whole method of I'm just going to replace everything is because it's faster. But from what you've explained, it sounds like doing repair your way, not only is it more economically viable, but it also results in less red tape and getting done quicker. But I'm curious if you have any examples with time.
I can't go into specifics, but it's definitely, if it would take us 1 day to fix something, depending on what the equipment is, the lead time could be 1 to 2 months for other things. It is astronomically different. There's been situations where I straight up forgot something minor was broken because it was something that was out of our control to fix. And then it's like, oh, hey, cool, sweet, we're finally fixed. And I think part of this is the fact that, especially for remote sites, they get chronically neglected. When you have a finite amount of money to spend, it's going to get spent proportional to the amount of people. So even if you have a small site that functions in a very critical manner, you're going to spend the money that has 100 sailors at it or something before the team of 5 gets $1,000 to replace their 20-year-old AC system. And the crazy thing about that is that we just learn to live with these deficiencies. Even in the Navy, we had that problem. We would joke about how we're not supposed to live with deficiencies, and then you can point and go, oh, what about that? What about that? That thing over there, how about that? Oh, let me put a tag on that real quick. I don't think it's acceptable for you to go, oh, hey, your utility transformer is leaking the internal oil, but it's fine. We're going to replace it 10 years. Hope it doesn't blow up. That's what I'm dealing with right now. I feel like the opportunity cost of 10 grand is probably more than that because it'd be a government contract, is a lot smaller than just getting it fixed. That's really what it comes down to.
With these bills, I mean, a lot of them, they read similar to the ones for the consumer electronics and the auto industry, making parts, schematics, diagrams available. What are the items that you think politicians that may have their heart in the right place but are not veterans that served as technicians in the military may be missing from the big picture here? What are the things that need to be included here for this to actually matter?
I think the single line that could have the most impact is ensuring that if a piece of hardware is going to be given out to the military, especially if you're going to be in an isolated area, you have to provide some type of training to somebody that would maintain it, as well as the actual reference material to get that job. This goes back to what I was saying before. It's a conflict of interest. Even if you have the best intentions, nobody in their right mind would write a contract that costs them millions of dollars. You're going to advocate for yourself. And I think that part of the problem is that there isn't adequate context for emphasizing the need for well-trained technicians where it matters. And this includes training. I acknowledge that some things don't matter as time goes on. I'm still aware of a couple of things that operate on electron tubes in 2025, which is insane. We all know that doesn't get taught anymore. And as things progress, you're chopping off the bits at the end. I've seen wire wrap stuff, before soldering, and I'm 26. There's a lot of really old hardware at a lot of really important places. And eventually you're going to lose those tech wizards that just know it because they were there when it was installed. And once you lose those people, all you can do is turn to the external contractors, which is kind of already what happened. And because there's going to be a low supply and a virtually infinite demand because it's the military, the taxpayer is going to pay for that.
Jeez. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Anything that you think I missed in my line of questioning or any blind spots I have that you want to illuminate?
I just wanted to reemphasize that going towards commercial off-the-shelf equipment, while easy for cranking out designs and having multiple places basically have the same language because they use the same parts, I would argue that signing a contract that doesn't include the as-built drawings as almost malicious, because off-the-shelf equipment, you can look up all the information you want online. You can talk to the manufacturer, but it doesn't matter if you don't know how it's connected. That is a very critical aspect. Regarding training, I would argue it's a matter of national security. I think this is what would get every senator involved, because obviously they are more interested in jobs for the region, money for the state, but everybody should care about national security. The environment we're facilitating relies on external contractors to the point where we are leeching all of the knowledgeable operators and maintainers to the civilian side. I only did 6 years in the Navy. Now I'm working as a contractor, and I'm making over twice as much as I made in the Navy. And when everybody knows that, of course you're going to have retention problems. The enlistment bonus for my rate in the military, a reactor operator basically, $100,000, the congressional cap. And I turned it down because I knew I'd still make more in the civilian side.
That's a whole other talk that I was excited to get into, because you hear people talk about recruitment and how recruitment numbers are up, but I'm always been curious, why do you never talk about retaining the people that you have? I don't have high recruitment at my company because the people that are in the other room have been here from 2013. It takes time to train people, and I want to make sure that they want to stay here, because training new people takes 3, 6, 9 months, sometimes a year, just to figure out if you'll be good at this. And that's expensive, which means keeping the people that you have is often making sure that they can afford to stay with you. Can sometimes be the cheapest thing that you can do, even if it costs you a lot more right now.
I want to address this. This isn't related to equipment repair, but I think this is contributing to the retention issue. One of the issues is that I think they have good intentions. They try to make sure you're well informed when you're considering and getting ready to transition to the civilian sector. But it's almost fear mongering when they say you get paid X amount of dollars, but really you're technically getting paid this because you have healthcare, housing, food allowance, and stuff like that. But it's painted in a way to basically scare you into staying. I think it's kind of absurd to brag about high enlistment rates while you have a bad economy, arguably. I mean, I think we technically meet the definition of a recession, regardless of what you want to say, because of 2 back-to-back reductions. But you're not going to have happy people if they're in the military putting themselves at risk potentially for monetary gain or for safety. I guarantee if you had more people that were allowed to mess around with stuff like this, you would have a better retention rate.
Can you put that up on the screen again? Just because the screen was
yeah.
Zoom cut out on me. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you very much for taking the time, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your service, and thank you for taking time out to help inform people like me that would like to know more about what they're talking about but don't know all of it. And I appreciate you being patient with me throughout the entire way.
I appreciate you reaching out, listening to me, and I think you're doing a good job.
Thank you.
I think this is very necessary.